Special thanks to the first. Hey folks, so before we start the video, I just wanted to give out a brief spoiler warning for the following things here. I noticed some people like to do the Savage raids completely blind, so I figured I'd probably be best to put one of these things here. Alright, so now with that out of the way, onto the video. So over the past few weeks, I've been getting acquainted with quite a few interesting characters, some of which include the jailer in The Chains of Domination, an unhinged fantasy hippo in some sewers, and a mid-escape rotisserie chicken in the middle of a Told You So cosplay, with all of their rooms having labels that make me dyslexic for a game console. There's also not Dracula, but I haven't gotten to him yet, so we ain't gotta bring him up. It's a really freaking weird combo of things to deal with, I know, but that's what I'm here to talk about. Alright. So to get it out of the way, this is my very first Savage tier. At the time of recording this, I've only managed to get to P1S, P2S, and a little over halfway through P3S. And so far, it hasn't really been an exhausting experience. Granted, it would probably be a different story if I had done it solely through the Party Finder, but so far, a majority of my time in the Savage race has been with the static I've been invited to be a part of, and my free company's clear and prog runs. Now, you may have noticed I said, not an exhausting experience, instead of, I've had a lot of fun. The reason I said it this way is because I usually have fun with raids in general, even back in WoW, so it was never really a question of whether I'd enjoy them or not. My main problem about them has always been the prep work, and after going through some Savage prep work in Final Fantasy XIV, I'm realizing just how huge of a difference there is. Now, there is still a grind to go through for gear in Final Fantasy XIV. It's just not nearly as bad since you have options here. You can either grind for gil, grind for tombstones, grind for materials, or grind for favorites if the other ones don't work out. Fortunately for me though, over the span of time that I've been playing this game, I managed to safely farm myself a hefty sum of gil. So I was able to simply ulda my way to viability when the crafted gear released. I've also discovered that grinding for gil is probably the most meta grind of the lot, since I was able to afford enough material to pentamelt all of my main job set. And for you WoW folks, it's like gem slots, except forcing 3 or 4 extra slots into a piece of gear, with each extra slot not wanting to fit even harder. Now, doing this ends up making the crafted sets actually better than what the normal difficulty raid gear provides from sheer stat quantity alone, which is kind of neat because I'm not used to seeing crafted gear being like the bestest slot for a while. It's kind of a foreign concept to me, but it's a welcome change because it means the professions are still relevant in endgame, and I'm glad to see that being a thing. Now, after you've got the gear, the only other things to get for maximum stat gains are food and potions. Now, granted, they're often sold at somewhat extortionate prices, but at least the food—
What rot! I, for one, think it's a marvelous
But at least the food buff doesn't get insta-gibbed on death here, and believe me, that ends up being worth a lot in the long run. Speaking of long runs and wipes, that's another thing that really does a bit more work than I initially gave it credit for. And that's the fact that when you die, you respawn right in the boss room. Mostly because that is the literal only thing that exists in the instance. There's no trash to mow through, no walk of shame, just straight to the boss. And honestly, I think this little detail helps with group morale quite a bit more than I initially gave it credit for, since it gives people generally less time to wallow in their thoughts and contemplate what they're doing with their life after a wipe. I know it's a bit of a small detail, but it's something I thought that was really cool. Another cool thing I noticed is, in the fights, they seem very meticulously and specifically crafted for a group of 8 people, which is the standardized raid group size, right down to the boss's room design. For instance, in P1S, there's a square for each member of the team to deal with during Intemperance. P2S has the arrows mechanic that leaves just enough room for 8 people to resolve it, and P3S has, well, it's got a lot in general, but for one example, it's the Dark and Fire mechanic, where it targets 4 players to spawn a Dark and Fire on. They need to be faced far apart or else they wipe the raid. The fires also need to be burned down by their DPS before they finish their massive raid-wide AoE, but they're invulnerable, which is where the kicker is. Okay, so shortly after the fire spawn, the boss will do a targeted AoE attack on each player in a sequence, and each fire needs to be hit by these AoEs at least 4 times each for those fires to become vulnerable for the DPS to burn down. Now, on paper, this sounds like it could be a right pain to deal with. But the part that I found really cool about it is that the literal floor just shows you the best spots to put them from its artistic design alone. And it's especially emphasized in the normal version of the fight, where the fires just naturally spawn on these squares as a foreshadowing idea and hint as to how to deal with it in the Savage version of it. Now, when I put 2 and 2 together with this, I thought it was such a cool detail. I know it's a really small thing to geek over, but I really do appreciate the idea of having the floor being a soft guide for the people that notice it. Shoot, it's probably why Dragoons stare at it so often. Now, that doesn't mean the floor solves everything. Like, far from it. It just gives you a clue for like 1 or 2 things. Everything else about the fight can be rather mean. One example is the common staple amongst all Savage raids, the damage down. If a mechanic doesn't outright kill you or the raid, it'll at least guarantee that you won't meet proper DPS checks within the next 30 seconds. Basically what it does is that it nerfs your damage pretty hard for 30 seconds before it falls off. I think it's around a 30% damage nerf, but I could be wrong. Now, I know that may not sound too incredibly bad since you have other people to rely on for the DPS checks, but that's the thing. There are only 7 other people in the group, 2 of them are tanks, 2 of them are healers, and 1 of them is probably already dead, so it's gonna be very freaking noticeable, and you just may not make the enrage timer in the end of that. And speaking of people dying in the raid, that's another thing. There are unlimited battle reses in this game. Like, there's no limit to them at all. Like, if someone dies, you can theoretically get resed forever. But there's another kicker with that, that's just inherent all the frickin' time in any instance ever. If you die and get raised, you get a 25% nerf across all of your main stats for a full minute. And if you die while that debuff is still on, the game mocks your misery and snaps a 50% nerf instead. For a full minute. Like, shoot, getting that 50% nerf debuff could actually result in a guaranteed wipe if your group isn't like hyper overgeared for the fight or something, because the DPS checks can be pretty tight, especially if it happens during mechanics that are designed to stress test your group's DPS capabilities. And, well, also stress test your group's stress levels in general by how freaking fast these mechanics can come out sometimes. Like, I've been progging as a green DPS, okay? So when mechanics start flying out like an angry wasp nest, I very much notice its effect on people as it tends to scare me back into being a healer. A few examples being Intemperance in P1S, the second Coherence in P2S, and like 2/3 of P3S in general. And the existential part is that there's a surprising level of emphasis on healer damage contribution in Savage. Legit, there have been some moments where we have wiped because I decided to prioritize healing everyone to full at some points of the fight instead of casting a few DPS attacks. Like, stuff like this makes me wonder if the game wants me to heal or to DPS. And then it punches me in the nose again before I can discover the answer to my existence. But after many attempts, we do eventually get the boss down, in which we encounter the loot system in this game, which honestly confused the heck out of me as to how it works when I first heard about it, but I think I got the gist of it now. So basically, the loot that drops is dependent on whether 4 or 8 people in your group have not cleared that specific Savage fight for the week. If 4 to 7 people in the group have not gotten their weekly clear, then 1 coffer will drop by the end of the fight, in which you can use to get a guaranteed item piece for whatever role you're on when you open it, based on whatever the coffer is, like a bracelet, necklace, helmet, and whatnot. And if all 8 people haven't done their weekly clear, then you will get 2 coffers instead of 1 at the end of the raid. Now, I really like this coffer system a lot, because it gives everyone a solid chance at a piece of gear. But there's still the PvP of rolling for the coffer, so there's still that chance that someone could be really unlucky and never win a loot roll. And for those folks, don't worry. The game's got you covered. Every time you clear a Savage fight for the week, you will automatically be given a book that you can use as a currency to simply buy the piece of raid gear you're looking for, even if you clear with the Zero Chest group. And yes, this vendor literally sells the gear that drops from the raid. But do keep in mind that each of the Savage raids drops a different type of book, and the gear that you can buy from the vendor is dependent on the loot table of that particular boss. So you still ultimately have to beat those bosses to get the gear. Now, I personally really like this system, as it allows everyone that's consistent with their clears to get the opportunity to get full bis. And the fact that you can see all the gear that drops from the raid from this vendor really helps out when it comes to planning out your gearing roadmap. Especially since the Tombstone vendor is literally just a couple of stalls away too. Like, honestly, this game is just extraordinarily generous with its loot distribution compared to what I'm used to dealing with. But honestly, that's probably because the extra loot isn't super necessary to complete the raids. Now, from what I've gathered, the biggest gains don't really come from having the fattest loot. It's from knowledge. Knowing how your job works is kind of an obvious one to point out, so instead I'll say that the best way to boost your performance is by knowing the fight, knowing how your group works, and managing your own skills in accordance with both the boss mechanics and your raid team. It's actually surprising how much of a game changer it is to shift the placement of a cooldown by just a few seconds. And shoot, some rotations could shift entirely based on what boss you're fighting, so the best bet in getting better is simply by just doing it more often. Now, if you're still hazy with your job's normal rotations and functions, you can still hammer out the kinks on a training dummy, but be prepared to adjust quite heavily when stepping into the boss ring. Those mechanics can really mess you up if you're not ready for them, in more ways than one. Now, that's not to say that gear doesn't matter, because it can help a lot. especially if you don't have the time to go that hard on researching your job. Though I have faith that all the content is clearable at the minimum item level, I do realize that that mostly stands for the more hardcore folks who are raring for a challenge. So for the fellows that don't have a lot of time to sink into the game but also want to get through Savage, just keep at it when you can. You'll get it down eventually. The gearing system in the game is rather forgiving, so the margin for error gets bigger and bigger as time goes on. Just focus on learning the mechanics first and foremost, and it'll all work out in the end. So all in all, I'm having a blast with this current Savage tier, and I love that it isn't demanding that I grind 40 hours a week to stay up to date with things. The fights are fun and fast-paced with nary a dull moment to them, and the music's got an interesting mood to it, there's plenty of tools for self-improvement, RNG is kept to a minimum, and the overall vibe of each attempt at the raid is so much more welcoming in general. And if need be, I can keep on queuing for the raid as many times as I want, even if I cleared. Though, I do feel pretty bad with the idea of denying someone a piece of loot for helping them out with their clears after I've done mine, so I don't really utilize that opportunity too often, but I still appreciate the feature existing. But that just about wraps up my 2 cents on the matter. Again, I still haven't cleared P3S and haven't even seen P4S, so I've still got another half of the raid tier to go. I'm curious to see what's in store with Not Dracula, but I'm going to need to step up my game for that to happen, so I'm going to head on off to brush up on a few taxes before the next raiding session. But before I go, I just want to take a moment to thank all of the folks on Patreon who have been supporting me with what I do. It means a lot to me that you folks will help me out and support me the way you do. And I realize I haven't been super active on, well, anything as of late, but I'm hoping to take a turn with that this year. Thank you very much once more for your support. And with that, I shall officially take my leave. Thank you very much for watching and/or listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful life. Take care, folks.